Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this discussion of the book in a digital age. Any industry that involves intellectual property, that involves ideas, is going through momentous changes. The New York Times, where I've worked for 15 years and now still write, but on a contract, is shrinking. You look at publishing, music, we're going through an epic change in how ideas are shaped and shared. And there are remarkable opportunities that come with that, but also big challenges. That the norms that built things like libraries are going away. So we're trying to reinvent how to create what David Weinberger, a writer who has a new book out on this change that's underway. We're trying to create a smart room, as he calls it. And I can't think of a smarter room than the one that will be assembled here on the stage shortly, when you see the panel will discuss this question of whether the book in a digital age. And it's not just about the technology and the business. It's about, there are new ways the freedom that comes with digital conveyance of knowledge and ideas can allow all kinds of creative potential to be exercised that couldn't fit in the pages of an old book like this one I pulled off my shelf this morning. So I'm going to introduce to you Jacob Weisberg, who's the president of an entity that perfectly articulates the new age we're in, the Slate Group, which was built around Slate magazine, quote unquote, which was a magazine that you can't find in a printed version unless you print it yourself, I think, right? And so Jacob Weisberg is going to introduce you to the rest of the panel and to this brisk discussion of where we go as a society and the industry of publishing and creators of ideas and the people who write books and how that's all going to play out. So Jacob Weisberg, come on up. Thank you. And there is a hashtag for this, for those following on Twitter. It's DESFISHBOOK, Desfish Book, like Desmond-Fish Library.
Thanks. I just wanted to make sure I had my props. I've got my iPad, Kindle Fire, iPhone. I read on all these devices, and we're going to talk about them. I really want to thank the staff and supporters of the Desmond-Fish Library for making this event possible, and Andy Revkin in particular for making it happen. I think the phrase neither hail nor sleet nor freezing rain applies. We started talking about doing this about a year and a half ago, and we were flooded out last year, and I've been looking forward to it all that time, and finally here we are. I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists today. This is a terrific group, beginning with my former neighbor, Dwight Garner, now sadly moved to the New Jersey Highlands.
It's good to be back.
I've been following Dwight's work since he was the first book critic and I believe book editor of Salon magazine, the magazine most frequently and still confused with Slate. Why we both chose five-letter words beginning with S, I'm not sure. Dwight, as I'm sure all of you know, is the daily book critic, one of the daily book critics for the New York Times. Next to him is Catherine Schultz, another terrific book critic, now for New York Magazine. She recently won the National Book Critics Circle Award for reviewing, and she is the author of Being Wrong, which is a wonderful book, and is, I think, very relevant today as we're going to discuss, because when we make predictions and discuss where things are headed, talk about the future, we're certain to be wrong in certain ways. Hopefully we'll be wrong in interesting ways. And lastly, Chris Hughes, who was one of the founders of Facebook. He doesn't look old enough to be a founder of anything, but there you have it. A recent new Garrison resident, one of the people who was most important in the 2008 Obama campaign with the online work he did around social media and the web for Obama. And most recently, as I expect some of you have read, the editor-in-chief and publisher of The New Republic, a magazine where I got my start in journalism, which he recently bought and I would say probably rescued. We'll see. We'll see. And we're going to talk amongst ourselves for about 40 minutes, and then I will open the floor to questions. And I think we're going to take the questions in written form, if I'm right about that. So if you have a question, please write it down and pass it to the aisle, and someone will bring it up, and I will read it for you. So I thought I'd start with a provocative statement, although one I actually believe to be true, and ask each of you to react to it. For 500 years, printing and reading were happily married, and now they're getting divorced. Dwight, am I right about that?
Yeah, but it's a slow, painful divorce that will be going on, and no one will leave home for a long time. I expect that during my lifetime, I will buy books and be able to buy them, I suspect, until I'm gone. I don't think books are disappearing. I think they'll slowly wither away and become harder to get and become somewhat boutique objects. I know that for me, I still, I'm a bit sentimental. I want to have this thing in my hands. I want to remember where I bought it. I want to remember who was with me when I bought it and who was there when I read it. And I want to find it years later and who I lent it to and what my notes are in it. And I stick postcards in books. Are this whole world of emotion I have attached to books. I think a lot of people do. And I think most of us will still have these things and still read like crazy online, and the boundaries will start to blend.
Yeah. Catherine, I would say that the point is not that books are going to become extinct. And I want to talk in a minute about each of our reading habits and the ways we consume literature, books, however you want to term it. But most people are going to do most of their reading in other ways pretty soon, right?
Probably, yeah. I mean, I suppose the question, what passed across my mind when you asked about the divorce is like, well, are we headed to divorce or are we headed to non-monogamy? Is the print book as we know it going to just sort of coexist along with all these other digital forms of reading, or is it really going to phase out? And I'm a little bit agnostic on that question. I think Dwight's right that for his lifetime, for my lifetime, books are going to exist as not just as physical objects. They'll always exist as physical objects for certain niche purposes, but they'll be, beloved and maintained in most households. They will exist sort of in the common realm. It's not clear to me as you drop down one generation, two generations from me, for instance, whether that's going to be the case. I mean, at that point, we might really be talking about a divorce and not just a proliferation of various ways to read.
Chris, you're sort of our representative of the future here. Are we going to? Yes, there are going to be books. Yes, there's going to be a library here. But are there going to be bookstores? Are we going to have this whole culture on the physical object of the book?
I think books will exist, but they'll be very much luxury goods. I mean, and I think I would be surprised if it's not in the next 10 to 15 years that it's more common for people to turn to their devices, whether it's an iPad or a Kindle, than it is to an actual physical book. I think they'll probably continue to exist, but I don't think it's probably all that different from something like classical music. It still exists. We still listen to pieces that were composed 200, 300 years ago, and there's a segment of society that really values going to the concert, but it's certainly something that is the domain of a few rather than the norm.
Yeah. I had a wonderful teacher in high school who I remember when she was teaching us The Great Gatsby, this is when I was growing up in Chicago, said, stop thinking of it as a book. Think of it as a text, and think of it as a scroll, or think of it as a stream of words. Think of it in some way that frees you from the printing and the composition of it on pages, because none of that is essential to the integral to the work in most cases. And it was interesting. I thought there was an article in the New York Review of Books a few weeks ago by Tim Parks, a very good writer, sort of making this point, I thought extremely well, that the work is the text. The work is not the book. So why do we get this reaction when we talk about people consuming texts, works of literature in ways other than physical object? Why are people so, for want of a better word, reactionary about it?
You want to go?
Sure, I'll jump in on that. I don't actually think it's necessarily reactionary, and I don't even know that I agree with the premise. I appreciate what your high school teacher was trying to say, but actually Gatsby is in some way inseparable from the form in which we read it. Even when you think about things like the evolution of, chapter breaks, right? These came about for a reason. Everything about the way that we consume novels in particular and books in general has to do to some extent with the form that we consume them in. And I don't think that I don't think the content is static and is going to remain entirely the same as the medium itself changes. And I also don't think that that our reading experience is static. I know about myself that I read very differently when I read a physical book, a paperback or a hardback, than when I read something online. So in fact, to me,
how so?
Yeah. How so? You know, I am sad to report that I read with less attention when I read on a screen. It's very clear to me, and I wish it weren't the case. And maybe I'm like a sacrificial generation, like sort of stuck between I grew up on books and sort of being encouraged to wean myself off of them in various ways, or at least indulge just as much in reading online. And I certainly read a ton online, but I don't read with the kind of sustained focus, the sense of real absorption, the sense of absolute kind of solitude that I experience with a book when I'm reading.
Do you read
online.
books on this or something like it? Have you read a novel in digital form?
Actually, no, I haven't. I do so right. In fairness, on some level, I'm comparing apples to oranges because what I read online is primarily journalism, although also some kind of I suppose I've read longer short stories and even novellas online. But I read on my laptop primarily when I'm reading, and there is a kind of the problem is, and this is not a problem that happens with, for instance, the Kindle, in fairness, but with most reading devices, and as the pressure increases to make all of these devices, sort of multifunctional in various ways, there's so much built-in distraction, right?
Yeah.
I mean, whenever you're looking at a book, there's 14 other tabs and 17 other things to do, and so forth.
Chris, how do you like to read?
I mean, so I tend to read, I will read paper and on a Kindle. And I have an iPad too, and I'll tend to move back and forth between the two depending on if I'm traveling, depending on the particular text. But I think this point that we're talking about now is in some ways maybe maybe the most interesting question to ask is, rather than will the book survive, will the notion of just text as a pure reading experience on a screen be what we define as a book in the future? Because there are all these studies that show that, not all these, there are 2 or 3 studies that show that if you take a group of people and they just read a text with just words, regardless of whether it's on paper or screen, and then you take that same group of people and you hyperlink it. So the story that's referenced in the text, you could click out and read more about that, or even a piece of music that's referenced, you could listen to it. It's much more rich, and we would assume that would be a more meaningful experience. If you take 2 groups and then you assess after and you ask them afterward, the group that had no hyperlinks actually felt better after reading it, and they understood the text better. They could answer questions with a higher degree of aptitude. And so, the question that I think is packed in here is, will the future of the book be one where we can just read text, or is the web and all of these devices going to force us to have all of these layers that are underneath and constantly reward that culture of digital distraction that I worry a lot of people are a part of, including myself a lot of the time?
You raised a couple interesting issues, which I want to revisit in a second. But first I wanted to ask Dwight. Dwight, you had an article last week in the Week in Review where you basically tried every form of reading, and my favorite part was when you talked about how sexy you thought it was. So when your wife listened to audiobooks and put the phone in her bra.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you were sort of describing me. I'm sort of an omnivore. I listen to books, I read them digitally, I read them in print. I kind of take them in the most convenient form. But what was your, after that sort of test drive of everything, what did you come off thinking?
It's a cornucopia. I mean, I just loved playing with these machines, and I still do at home, even though when I want to read a book, I really actually want a physical book for the most part. One of the things I discovered, or one of the things I said, is that really I think the iPhone is the greatest gift to literacy that we've seen in generations. I mean, it obliviates this fear one has of being trapped somewhere with nothing to read. And with my phone, there's always, you're at the DMV or on a bus. I remember searching when I commuted for 10 years, I'd be on that train once in a while at night and nothing to read, and this hour-long trip, and hunting for a New York Post under every seat. And, and now I don't have to read the New York Post. I have great stuff, thanks to Twitter, frankly, which is where I find most of my reading material these days. Twitter has really changed my life. With Twitter, like life, it matters who you follow, and if you follow the right people, Twitter is very rewarding. But I've begun to read novels on the Kindle, which I think is a rather immersive experience. If you can't go online, I found myself really turning the pages and being very immersed in books on the Kindle. Less so with the iPad, because I'm too tempted to play around, and my email's pinging, and the kids want to play games on it, and it's just it's a fun machine, but it's not the immersive Kindle-like experience.
Right. Well, that gets to Chris's point about if sort of literature has links, and there are all these things taking you away from the centrality of the text or the narrative experience, whatever it is, you're not necessarily getting that kind of immersion.
There are many, I mean, for example, there are many books now that come with their own apps for the iPad. I mean, I read one, there's, Kerouac's On the Road, and you can, hit one button and see maps, and you could see where he stopped, and it's quite lovely, but... Which
was written as by the way, as a scroll.
A scroll.
Right.
But I guess I'm too old. I mean, it's just not for me. I mean, if I want TV, I have TV. There are many books about Kerouac and his travels, and but a lot of science books are coming now with film and with music, and I don't know. It just seems to me apples and oranges. I kind of want a book when I want a book.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there are other things coming that we haven't dreamed of yet.
So let's talk a minute, Catherine, maybe you can pick up on this idea of literature moving beyond the page and the things it can do. So Chris's comment was sort of skeptical about that for the sort of distraction reason. But aren't there these great literary opportunities? I mean, if you were an experimental novelist now, you would be playing with these forms, right? We've done a couple of these experiments on Slate, and I can't say any of them was 100% successful, but they've all been really interesting. Walter Kern wrote a novel on Slate, about 8 years ago, called The Unbinding, which was filled with hyperlinks and websites created for the book, and it was the theme of it was sort of digital surveillance, and it kind of worked in a way. I mean, he was doing things there that you can't do, at least in the same way, on the printed page.
Sure, there's lots of things you can't do on the printed page. I'm sitting here looking at you slightly skeptically just because I feel like, yes, I think there's amazing opportunities there. Whether those opportunities exist for novelists and for writers is a different question. I mean, at a certain point, when you're creating websites and soundtracks and whatever else people are creating these days, videos for their books, you're actually not a writer. You're incredibly multi-talented, but
you're a
what you're doing
multimedia artist.
You're a multimedia artist, right? You're doing something, and a multi-platform artist. You're doing something very different than what it is that writers do. And in fact, in some ways, something that is, I don't exactly want to say antithetical to what writers do, but I mean, certainly speaking for myself, you have no control over how someone reads your book, but you write it in this sort of naive hope that people will actually sit down, pick it up at the beginning, and read it through to the end. You aren't actually trying to fracture their attention out in 400 different directions, and they don't need any help from me with that. Attention is already fractured. So I don't know. I mean, I think yes, of course, all of these platforms and all of these technologies are gonna produce, I think, really amazing work. It's not clear to me that that is the work of the novelist. In fact, I would argue, I mean, David Foster Wallace could write a book that captures everything that's interesting about the age and the experience and the fracturing of identity. I mean, great novelists can write about this without writing in exactly those means. And for anyone who's actually tried to read, for instance, kind of like a hyperlinked novel anytime recently, I mean,
it's not much fun. They're not very good.
It's really, it's
kind of a discredited form already.
I mean, I hate to be so harsh, but they're essentially unreadable.
Wouldn't you rather have clicked on those David Foster Wallace footnotes than had to follow them from page to page and weave back and forth to the text?
Not I.
There's one really interesting company called Atavist. I don't know if you've heard of it, but what they do is they enable authors to write 10,000, 15,000 word long form pieces. It tends to be, I think, nonfiction. But they have two different versions of their product. One is on the iPad, and it is very much what we're talking about here. They're inventing the future of this reading where there's hyperlinks throughout, there's even music. The author can choose a soundtrack for you to listen to as you go. You can move it so the author reads to you if you're mobile, but if you want to sit down and read it, you can turn off the voice. I mean, it's got all of these layers. And the other version of their product is on the Kindle, and it's Kindle singles, really, which are, where you can, it's essentially self-publishing on those lists. And what they find is that the Kindle singles product, where people are just reading the text, remains sort of the most interesting item, and it's what is bought the most frequently. And I think that all of our reactions to wanting to read and just read, there may be, I mean, it's early days, but there may be something there about that really tells us about what we'll be doing 15, 20 years from now.
I think that's a very good segue for us to talk a little bit about the economics of literature and the economics of publishing, because one of the big fears here clearly is that whatever these new models are, where reading is going, assuming reading doesn't go away completely, or reading literature in long form doesn't go away completely, it's that it won't support the act of writing, the art of writing. And Kindle in particular is something that's very, very threatening to publishers, because books, well, if it's left to Amazon, nothing would be more expensive than $9.99, and you can actually buy books on Kindle. Well, these Kindle singles are 99 cents in many cases, much less than the newsstand price of a magazine. So, Catherine? Why don't you talk about that a little bit? I mean, I know as a writer, you have to think about this, right? If you do your next book, how are you going to publish it?
Sure. I mean, I should say I'm not an expert in the economics of publishing by a very long shot, but of course it is something that I worry about, because one of the things, I see a lot of non-worrisome innovations and developments in the media landscape, really exciting things that I think are interesting, that I think are good for the culture at large. But the thing I circle back to over and over is, what is the economic model here that allows a writer to survive? Because frankly, if you don't have one in place, you don't have writers, and then the whole culture does suffer. I mean, we all want to be reading good stuff, and we want an economic model that not only allows the sort of abstract writer to survive, but we want it to allow, we want it to support and encourage a huge diversity of voices. We want it to nurture people for a long time. We want it to, make it possible to fail and then succeed, to be mediocre and then succeed. I mean, Don DeLillo was a mid-list writer for like 7 books before Underworld came out. We need some kind of structure that makes it possible for writers to survive. And in the past, that's been the book advance, which I will be the first to admit was always an economically iffy proposition. It was a huge gamble. It made no sense. The numbers are pulled out of thin air. It's not good bookkeeping, but it worked to some extent for some authors, more than anything else has. And I look around and I don't see, honestly, what that new model is that's going to support people. And that is scary.
Dwight, are publishers and agents right to fear Amazon, and should writers fear Amazon? Their interests may diverge.
Yes and no. It's a good question. It's a bit like the music business. A lot of bands now don't sell a lot of music. They make their music by touring. And something similar is happening. The plates are shifting for novelists and for writers. I suspect advances will get a bit smaller. But as a culture, we revere our writers so much, and there are so many opportunities for writers, at least good ones and ones who persevere, to teach or to get grants. There are a lot of places to go find work. When I became a journalist at a young age, one of the things that seemed great about it to me was that it paid so poorly that it kept the morons out. And so only people who really wanted to do it did it. And there are so many. The same is slightly true for writers. Those who really want to do it and care about it, they're going to do it. And they'll find a way. And frankly, I've never felt that writing was so important to the culture as it is now. I mean, I know so many kids who hold away writing novels or in writing programs now, and somehow the fracturing of how we absorb culture has made a generation, I feel like, want to go deeper and want to become serious long-form writers. That's what I feel anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the way the music business was disrupted by digital technology is a big negative example. But there's some big differences, aren't they? I mean, for one thing, people don't seem to steal books, Abby Hoffman notwithstanding. But, there's not, I've actually noticed that some of my books are available on BitTorrent, but I'd be amazed if anybody's going to that much trouble to get something that you can buy used for 47 cents plus $3.99 shipping from Amazon. And also, you have this. I mean, there's a certain amount of music business, a certain amount of overhead to create a band, to tour, to create a record. But, this Amazon model, I have to say, as a writer, it's pretty appealing. You write it, and you get 70%. If you write a Kindle single, or I think if you publish your book exclusively on Kindle, you get 70% of the royalties. So you can make as much as a writer on a book priced for $3 or $4 as you do on the book priced for $24.95 published in print form.
Do you know people who've made money by writing Kindle singles or by doing similar things?
Well, I think you just wrote about the Kindle
it
single
sounds
program.
like some very famous people are making money. I don't know if civilians are making money.
I mean,
meaning most people, most decent writers. Do you know?
Well, I think it's as you say. I mean, some writers with established names. I know Andy Borowitz, the humorist, just published a Kindle single, which cost 99 cents, which is a very entertaining memoir. And I gather it's sold approaching 100,000 copies. So that certainly supports that activity. And there have been things that have been sort of the equivalent of extended magazine articles published in that form, where I think you probably do better writing it as a Kindle single if marginally, than you do writing it for a glossy magazine, because one of the things that's happening in the world is magazines are paying a lot less than they used to. But it's all in flux.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that's good, but there's obviously a lot of downside. It's not nearly as predictable. I mean, as this piece of the conversation is just bearing out, I think the idea that, you write a book, you get an advance, and then if it does well, you get increased royalties. I mean, that model, I think, has to be at least receding, which I think is a good thing for readers, because it means that there are more books out there, there are more things that are published, and there's not a middleman in the form of the publishing company. It's a mixed bag. Well, it's a bad thing for the publishing company, and I think it's probably very much a mixed bag for the authors, because while there is this opportunity to make money off of Kindle singles, and people like, just saw that Sam Harris had a new single out that has done apparently pretty well. There are authors who are doing it, but it means that it's a lot less predictable, and there's a really big open question about how the numbers actually fall out, because $2.99 for a Kindle single versus $3.99 doesn't sound like a very big difference, but that's an increase in price by 33%. And if most of that's going to the author, that can be the difference between making $60,000 and $80,000 a year, whatever the metrics are. So I think there's a lot still to be seen there.
So, Chris, you just brought up a magazine. In some ways, the essence of old media, but text-heavy, bi-weekly magazine that does have a website, but is still very much focused on the print audience. Now, this is a magazine that's always had, from the standpoint of the owner, an element of philanthropy. I think since it's been published, it's still maybe had a couple of years when it broke even, but basically haven't. But how are you thinking about the economics of what you're going to do with the New Republic?
I mean, I'm personally making a bet on this question that people still want to read now and want to read thoughtful, in-depth, high-quality journalism moving forward. So I feel like, at least in the marketplace just of journalism now, so shifting there a little bit from books, where most of the companies are moving is in the direction of the Huffington Post or Politico or the Daily Beast, or these companies that are trying to have a attractive headline which gets people to click through. You're able to serve an ad, boost the number of uniques, but as a reader or as a user, you don't really come away knowing a lot more than you would have just by reading the headline. It doesn't feel like a very good or quality experience. So I think there is a real group of readers, and no, it's probably not tens of millions, but I think there is a real core group of readers who crave that type of thoughtful, long-form narrative that not just the New Republic, but lots of other journalistic institutions out there do now. But I think that there's an economic opportunity there, and I also just think it's an important thing for democracy that we have good journalism. But I definitely think that there's a market demand for it.
And I agree with everything you said, but just to press the point, do you think a serious publication with the digital economics can support itself? I say this as an interested party.
I think there's a really big difference between the web and the tablet and the mobile device. I think that it's very difficult to get people to pay for content and information on the web, largely because there are so many other things to click on. There are other places to go. We tend to use the web for business, work, and entertainment. We're there doing everything inside the browser. When it comes to the iPad or the Kindle or the Nook or any of the other Android devices, or to some extent even the mobile phone, I think people are willing to pay for content if they know it's going to be quality and if they know that it's going to be served to them in a way that where they learn something or they come away feeling good about it. So I do think that there's a hope there. I think it's obviously a little dangerous to think of the tablet as a panacea to the publishing and journalism, all the problems that are out there. But I do think it is an experiential device in the way that the browser or the personal computer is not.
So people will pay for that convenience, for that experience, even if they might regard the content as more of a commodity they wouldn't pay for online.
Yeah, I think people will pay for experience. Now, again, how much they pay and how often they pay, I don't know. These are open questions, and we'll see.
So we've talked a little bit about Amazon. We're clearly in, strangely enough, a literary environment shaped by these giant technology companies, much more than the quaint print book publishers or booksellers, even factoring in Barnes and Noble. What do we think about them? Is Google a friend of the book, a friend to literature? The big issue about Google, of course, has been its initiative to digitize all of the world's libraries, which has run in tremendous controversy, partly because partly because of issues about rights and what belongs to writers, but partly because of the question of whether a private company should own the archive of everything ever written or published.
As someone who's currently writing a biography, I mean, what Google is doing is just an astonishing gift to the world, I think. I mean, not just to me as a biographer, but I mean, looking for some small reference now, it's a search on Google Scholar or some other site, and references I never would have found, and people, I mean, it's like a new nervous system for the world, what they're doing, and I just think it's a beautiful thing. They've got to find a way to pay writers. I mean, there's got to be a way to make it so that that there's some compensation for this material. But in terms of society, I think it's impossible to see it as a negative, what Google's doing. There clearly are issues with, I'd like to see people treated well, but I can't see that as a downside. I worry with Amazon coming on the way it is. It's starting to poach good talent from New York City. Publishers are scared to death. I worry about, we talked about quaint publishers. A lot of those quaint publishers are just brilliant, lovely people who care so much about books and edit them well, and it's because of them that books are as good as they are. Although I will say that for the New Republic, Jacob wrote a famous piece called "Houses of Ill Repute," one of the great pieces that magazine ever published, in which you said that publishers, they were kind of dropping the ball, that they weren't editing as much, and there were more typos in books. And do you still feel that's true? That the
gatekeepers... It's taken me a long time to live that down, Joy. Thank you for that.
How important are gatekeepers? It's kind of relevant in the sense that the gatekeepers are kind of falling away a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I was a little shocked when I wrote that piece, and this goes back 20 years plus, even a little bit, I think, that so many editors, including a lot of the sort of legendary names in business, didn't do any book editing. I mean, they essentially were book brokers, where they bought books, and books went through copy editing. But so many books were published in a way that did not indicate the sort of editing that, as a writer, you imagine getting from a great editor, or even a good editor. And I think the trend has probably continued as the economics of publishing have deteriorated, and I see come through the office of the New Republic and across my desk tremendous number of books that are poorly edited, overlong, that sort of show a lack of editing. At the same time, I've come to appreciate that there are some great editors out there who do something transformative with writers and with books, and they tend to flourish in niches and kind of out-of-the-way places in the business. But book business as a whole, it's hard to say.
Well, one thing that terrifies me about the literary culture right now is that when you were coming up, when I was coming up, and Catherine was coming up, there were terrific editors that we all worked with and who taught us how to do the things we do and made us better writers. And so many young writers now aren't getting that. They're writing for blogs, or they're writing for other places online, which is a good way to cut your teeth, except that no one is giving you feed. I mean, there's no one helping you to hone your arguments and become a better writer, which is why I think that editors and real publications still matter more than ever. Anyway.
At the same time, just to pick up on this point, the young people who come through our office, I think, are better writers than their peers 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, partly because they've had so much more practice. Writing is like learning an instrument or learning a language. More than anything else, it's about daily practice. And blogging and tweeting and being Facebook, being online, you may not be writing literary or literate grammatical sentences all the time, but I think young people now most of them write every day. And not just talking on the phone, and even texting is a kind of literary form that puts a premium on concision, on humor, on a certain kind of effective communication. And I don't know if any of you, I'm trying to be as provocative as possible today, but I think all of this is making young people better writers. I don't know if it's making them better readers.
I thought you just found them, because Slate always has the best young writers in America. Slate is like the farm other magazines pluck from, you know. So I thought you guys just had them. So
well, maybe that's my sample, but I don't know. I mean, Catherine, sort of pick up on that thought. I mean, do you worry about the young in relation to, you know, in relation to the culture of the word? I mean, do you worry that people aren't going to have the experiences that enabled all of us or caused all of us to become writers and readers, from the teaching of writing to the editing to the experience of books to...
Yes and no. I mean, I actually think your point is an interesting one, that young people are writing all the time now because they have a sort of instant platform. It's what their culture is doing. Everyone is on Facebook and on Twitter and so forth. I'm not totally sold on that as a, you know, ideal daily practice. Like, I wish I thought that my excessive Twitter habit made me a better writer, but I'm pretty dubious about that proposition. I think, you know, I don't tend to be alarmist about, like, you know, kids today, right? Like, kids today are always kids today. They're going to fare well. They're going to come up with brilliant things. They're going to write stuff I never could have dreamed of. I have faith in the sort of big picture sense. I think the one thing that does concern me, and this is sort of what I was getting at in one of my earlier comments, is the issue of attention span. I think that, you know, to feel in myself the fracturing of attention, and I'm someone who grew up, you know, without the abundant sources of distraction that we all have now. I mean, we all grew up with some of them, but, you know, from a very young age, I had the habit of immersing myself in a book, and I do think it's a habit. I think it's a practice. I think it's something that you learn and you get used to, and you develop a tolerance, right? And there's this wonderful Jeff Dyer essay in his new book, or comment in his new book, about how he just, you know, in no universe would he have the attention span for late Henry James anymore, right? I mean, those sentences are longer than, like, you know, 7,000 tweets. And I happen to love them, but I did grow up with that kind of, again, that immersive experience. And I worry about that attention span, and I worry in particular, you know, you just commented, like, oh, the forms that these kids are working in favor concision, they favor humor. I'm totally in favor of concise, witty things, don't get me wrong, but I also think it's important that there's still a place in the culture for long, serious reading. And I gotta tell you, one of the few things that actually drives me crazy about our current literary culture is the reflexive dislike of long things. Right? I mean, it's like length is an intrinsic bad. There's this horrible acronym out there on the internet these days, which is TLDR, too long, didn't read, which is actually a logical impossibility, right? If you didn't read it, you have no idea if it was too long or not, right? How would you know that? And I worry about that. I worry about whether we can still engage seriously and at length on topics that deserve to be treated at length. But
help me out here, Chris. I mean, does sort of reading short and writing short and doing things in short bursts actually hurt your attention span? Is there any evidence of that? I mean, just again, anecdotally, I find that reading shorter things all day makes me crave the more immersive experience of long-form writing when, you know, at other times, even evenings and weekends. In fact, in my case, which may not be indicative of anybody else, it's the middle length that suffers because I'm on Twitter all day. I then want to go read a book at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I'm clearly bullish about long form and think that people tend to crave it and want to read it. On the writing point, I think we really have to hold fast to this value of teaching, particularly college-age kids, great writing. I mean, the expository writing programs that are at colleges today, I think, you know, I'm sure there are great ones and there are horrible ones, but I think that the art of writing itself does so much to transform the way that a person sees the world, the way that you're able to weave together ideas, hold different concepts in your consciousness at one time or another. I think writing is incredibly important, and the best way to make sure that it remains to be strong, I think, is to teach it and to cultivate it. And I think that's a curriculum challenge that particular universities, of course, high schools too, need to value.
And say something more about that. I mean, one of the difficulties of teaching writing, it's incredibly labor intensive, right? Yeah. Teaching writing is a form of editing. It's one-on-one working with someone on their sentences. You can't do it in a classroom with 40 people or in a lecture hall.
Yeah, it's a challenge, and it's also one of the things that's harder to use all the everything that's new and exciting about digital education opportunities and long-distance learning. I mean, writing is a very difficult thing to teach. But I guess my larger point is we pay so much attention to math and science, and these are important subjects to fund, and I absolutely am behind funding them. But I think that we should talk about teaching good writing in the same way that we talk about valuing the math and science fields for the people who are growing up now.
Great. Well, at this point, I want to open it up to some of the questions I've just gotten from the audience and from our participants, which look to be very good indeed. The first one I want to ask, this person asked two questions, but we covered the first one, which was about Google digitizing books. The other question is, if printed books will be less common, how will libraries function going forward? Obviously very relevant to this room and the people in it. Anyone?
I will say, having moved to New Jersey recently, it's great to be back at this library, which is like Downton Abbey compared to the one that I have now. It's really a great place up there. I'm not privy actually to librarians. I mean, I've overheard some of the things going on here, but I really don't know. I feel like libraries, as you know, libraries are branching out into you can borrow an ebook now. I think publishers are making that difficult, as they probably have to a little bit. I have some sympathy for them, not just wanting anyone to just call up the library and get free books or free ebooks, willy-nilly. I think you should be able to get them, but there should be some limits placed on that. I still think, I'm still holding on to the fact that a minority of people, but a serious number of people, will want to continue to have physical books as objects in libraries. It's not so hard for a library to get one copy and to have it for someone to borrow. I don't know, do you guys add to that?
I love libraries and I love bookstores, but I think they're immense challenges. I mean, I think they have to be reinvented as institutions. I mean, the type of events that we're doing here today at the library, I think are really important, where you bring together a lot of curious people to sort through important social and cultural problems. But this idea that there will be a place where people go to get a book to read, I'm pretty pessimistic, even in 5 to 10 years, that will be that'll be the reality.
Only major cities, I suspect, really major cities will have bookstores in 5 years, don't you think?
Yeah.
Or 10?
I remember going to the, several years ago when the new public library in Chicago opened, the Herald Washington Library, going in and not being able to find the books. It was one of the first major city libraries built for a digital age, and it's a community center. It has all sorts of things, and the books are not on the ground floor. They're somewhere it does have books.
My family has this rule that whenever we see a record store, we have to stop in and buy something just because they don't exist anymore, and we have to support the record store. And now we're getting there with bookstores. I mean, where I live, there's not one within 40 minutes, and it's just, who would have thought?
In fairness, though, I have to say that that's happening for a reason, which is that there's actually a better and more efficient way to get a wider number of books. The one thing the internet is actually incredible at is giving you access to essentially any book you could possibly want to read, and that is true no matter where you live. It's true if you live in rural Nebraska, it's true if you live in rural Tajikistan practically, it's certainly true if you live in New York City. And so in that sense, I think look, I love bookstores, I love libraries, I spend a lot of my time in them, I grew up in them, but if what we value is the core function of distributing books to readers, we actually have an excellent mechanism in place. If there's other things that we value, and I think we do, like bringing people together for interesting conversations, like a certain access to a physical object, then I think these institutions need to reinvent themselves around and find a way to be sustainable around those goals, because what used to be the central goal, which was distributing reading material, is actually being done really, really well in another way.
Yeah. Okay, we have some very good questions here. Here's another one. Will books persist as a prime marker of one's status in the world of ideas? That is a really good question. That is a really good question. I think you all understand what it means. So, yeah. I mean, you have to, a book is a certain kind of marker, right?
As an author or as a reader?
Yeah, what was the final bit of that question? I'm sorry.
Oh, in the world of ideas. I took the question to mean if you have a big idea or something important to say, when you write a book and attach your idea to a book, it gives it a certain status, which it's hard to get if you just write an article or you just do it in some other form. And is that still going to be a sort of intellectual marker that, here's the book that says this?
It certainly is the case today, and that's been really interesting for me to realize. I mean, I had an editor make the case to me recently of like, why are you going to spend 5 years of your life killing yourself to write a book that, some relatively small number of people, a couple 100,000 people, if you're very lucky, are going to read, when, you can spend a month, write me a 5,000-word magazine piece, and 2.4 million people are going to read, or whatever. And so on the face of it, you would think that it's these shorter form journalistic articles and so forth that have more cultural clout, and yet today it is clearly the case that a book is still the central mechanism we have to disseminate ideas, basically. And I think it is, it has a kind of cultural clout that shorter form things, articles get popular, they shoot up to #1 in the New York Times most read list or whatever, but they don't have that kind of, they don't become these sort of like little, I don't know, like black, I don't mean black holes in the negative sense, but in the sense of like places of very dense gravity in the culture that then people gather around them. And I'm not quite sure what other than a book would become that.
But society often awards that status, I think, incorrectly.
Oh,
your book is lean and vicious and beautiful all the way through. I reviewed it. I'm not just, but 8 out of 10 books are just, far too. What was your little LT?
Too long. TLDR.
TLDR. I'm just going to start writing that at the top of my review. But far too many books aren't well written. They aren't well thought through. They're large for no good reason. And frankly, a Kindle single would do for many, many of the books that I review in the Times. They're 150 pages too long on average.
Right.
The
the other way to read that question is all these things are turned into books that don't need to be. They're turned into books for the sake of giving the author intellectual status as opposed to efficient or effective communication.
Bill Keller, the former editor of the Times, wrote a piece recently to the staff basically saying, or it was published in the Times, but saying, books are overrated. He said to the staffers, consider just writing this as a long piece for us. Everyone's taking these book leaves. And too many Times staffers write books even to review them all in the Times. There's a Times staffer with a book every other day, and not knocking any of them. A lot of them are beautiful, but I think he has a point. I think we're getting there, too, to the point where things like Kindle singles, things between articles and books, will become more valued and more popular.
Yeah. It's been said that a camel is a horse designed by a committee. If writing becomes more collaborative in the digital age, might quality decline?
Yeah, I think I don't see a lot of great collaborative writing. Obviously, Wikipedia is an example that everyone uses for collaboration. That's an incredible resource for all of us, but I think people also universally agree that Wikipedia is not particularly well written. So I'm not, even though I have a digital background, I'm not actually that hopeful about collaborative writing per se. I think voice and narrative and intent and all of these things that come from a single author, or maybe two authors, are going to continue to be really important.
Some people have tried to write novels using Facebook, taking in, and part of the appeal of that, of course, is that you engage an audience in the process, and then when you're done with the book, you have a bunch of people who have a stake in it because they've made suggestions to you or they've reacted to your ideas.
I think it's a very interesting experiment. I'd love to see more people do that and experiment with it, but I don't know if someone else has, but I haven't seen anything that's been that successful that's taken that approach.
Yeah.
One thing I would say about collaboration in the digital age, I agree. I'm not optimistic about it as a way to, produce beautiful literature. But the experience of being an author in an age when access to other people is effortless is quite remarkable, actually. And I think, to me, what's the sort of best collaborative possibility isn't about, writing to me is fundamentally an incredibly lonely, isolating process, right? It happens in your head. You are alone, essentially, in a cave with your laptop. As far as I can tell, there's no other good way to do it. Some people do manage to collaborate well, but for the most part, for most people, I think that's how the process works. On the other hand, and precisely because it's so lonely and isolating, it's quite astonishing to be able to connect so easily with readers and especially with other writers in a way that just was absolutely not possible even a decade ago. And that experience, I think, speaks to some extent to this question of where do you find editors, writing teachers, people who push you, like who's out there raising the bar? And the answer invariably is your colleagues, right? Who's raising the bar is the people who are better writers than you are, and talking with them and engaging with them. We've always been able to read each other's work, but it's so incredibly easy now to just be in touch. And that piece of the kind of digital leveling of the playing field or whatever, I find incredibly welcome.
Next question. What's the future of the coffee table book? It's not appropriate for any of the new devices.
It's not true.
Well.
It's not true. On the iPad, they're beautiful. I mean, the resolution. I mean, I prefer books, but I've looked at some recently, and I wrote in my piece. It's like a snort of some visual drug. I mean, they're so beautiful, and a lot of them are free. You can look at them for free. I forget which. Is it MoMA? One or two of the museums have made them available for free, art books. I don't know if you guys have any other opinions about that.
But what happens when you spill your coffee on them?
It's a big
It's really bad
expense.
for your eyes. I suspect those
Yeah.
kind of high-end art books that require a lot of photography and so on and so forth. I mean, they've always been niche. They've always been very expensive to produce. They are absolutely beautiful on the iPad, especially the new one, staggering, no question. But I have a feeling those will persist, partly because by definition, a coffee table book has always been only half a book, right? A lot of what it is like it's an ornament. It's something you put in your house. It's the same way that you put a, attractive lamp there or whatever. And so I think there's always going to be a market for that.
Yeah. One further thought is one of the paradoxes I've noticed is that I think we're living right now through a renaissance in book design. Dwight, I don't know if you agree with me, but
I do.
But I think because books sort of have to make their case on more than being the only way to get the content, they're trying a lot harder. And Penguin and other publishers now, I think, are doing the most beautiful new books I've seen in my lifetime.
I agree. And we
Yeah.
live in this sort of artisanal culture now at the Etsy world. And,
Yeah.
and young people are just making, how old am I? But young people are making, these gorgeous books. And I think people like McSweeney's and what Dave Eggers is doing there with their book design. And more little publishers, I think, will be releasing great stuff on paper.
How long before advertising asserts itself in the delivery of digital books?
Is it there already?
It's already happened in some forms. I mean, if you get, I think the Kindle, if you get the cheapest Kindle, you pay less, and it comes with advertising.
Oh,
and
it's
you
a
pay
nightmare.
not
I've
to
got
get
one in
the
my
ad-
house, and when you leave it alone, I'm sure everyone knows, but you leave it alone for 5 minutes, it reverts into an ad. It's sitting there on your table, and it's just a bummer. Suddenly, Omaha Steaks is looking at you from the book,
or that really unflattering portrait of Jane Austen.
Exactly. But I remember as a kid picking up paperbacks, and you get to the middle, there'd be like an ad for menthol cigarettes in the middle. You remember that? So it's not entirely new territory.
This same person asked another question, which is really interesting, which is whether books are going to promote a Big Brother society, which the point I take to being that you're with Amazon or an iPad, you're feeding back information all the time, and there's massive data being accumulated on you and your interests, and that can be a positive for you as a consumer in terms of the recommendations Amazon makes, which, at least in my case, are sort of diabolically accurate. But at the same time, is it creepy? I mean, this is reading. This is in some ways the most sort of personal, one of the most personal things we do. Is it creepy that these big technologies have data warehouses where they're keeping track of everything we've read and everything we've looked at? Yeah.
I think it's important that every reader, every user be able to turn off any tracking of that nature, or be able to erase your history and do read in private, if you will. I think most readers, like you said, appreciate the recommendations. In fact, the Kindle has introduced this functionality where you can, if you turn it on, you can actually see what other readers have highlighted in the process, which is not something that I keep on consistently, but sometimes if you are moving through something quickly, or even if you just want to see what other people have thought was important in a really dense text, can be really interesting. But I have a feeling that companies will still want to empower readers to do so in private, and be able to control the information that's associated with their accounts.
Another thing about privacy, quickly, is that I used to think that for my kids, for example, or for any kid, that reading, let's say, the kind of novels that parents used to take away from their kids, like Judy Blume for Forever or something. Well, a kid could read it and the parents wouldn't know because they can't tell what they're reading. What's the upside? But then it occurred to me that my kids, you can't buy an ebook without it showing up on my credit card statement. So I'm going to know in a way, it's working against them in their efforts to read slightly dirty books. So they're going to have to buy paper.
Very good. All right, some of these questions are from people who clearly are not on Twitter. They're a little long, but I'm going to read this one because this looks interesting. The invention of the book changed writing from the 16th century on. Why won't the invention of the screen do the same from now on? For example, films and TV changed the nature of dramatic writing. Play is not a screenplay. And nuclear weapons changed wars from big ones to little ones. So we were getting at this a little bit ago, but I'm glad someone asked that more directly. Is digital consumption and publication going to change the nature of writing?
I think probably, yes and no, I will sit on
Thank
the
you for
fence.
taking that
So
one.
convenient. I mean, in fiction, my hunch is, we're inveterate storytellers. We've been telling stories in one form or another for as long as our species has existed, or at least as long as the record of us telling those stories exists. And that's going to persist, and people are going to do it in all kinds of creative ways. And will they avail themselves of the kind of unique opportunities presented by these different platforms and technologies? Sure, right? But I think stories are stories. They're not going anywhere. The nonfiction form, I think, probably might change more, if anything. I mean, I think that right now we are in this kind of strange experimental moment, like a paradigm shift in the classic, like Thomas Kuhn sense, where like things are falling apart, and so you're sort of throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks, and most of it doesn't. It's mostly terrible, and that's why we're getting things like, books with like soundtracks and maps that pop out. I mean, the maps that pop out can be kind of cool, but I think we haven't figured out what that is. But I suspect that yes, the technologies are inevitably going to change the content, and to me, in some ways, that's both the most interesting and kind of exciting thing about these developments, and then the most sobering in that, I think that's the kind of change that you don't want to let it happen passively, and you don't want the substantive, intellectual, conceptual stuff that we all really care about to get dictated in this kind of weird top-down way by technologies that are indifferent to content, right?
Yeah. Well, let's frame this a little differently, Chris. I mean, printing was a tremendously democratizing culture, right? Reading and writing were elite activities dominated by the priesthood before the invention of printing. Just as an aside, I was amazed to learn one time that silent reading was something that had to be invented in classical times. People either read aloud or they basically sounded all the words out, and then at some point a monk looked across the table and he saw somebody was reading without moving their lips, and then everyone started to be doing. But I mean, you think of sort of these cultural things as fixed, but in fact so much can change about it. But if the Gutenberg Revolution was democratizing and brought all this political change and so on, what does the digital revolution do? Is there a risk that it goes in the other direction and makes reading and writing more of an elite activity again?
I mean, in short, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that Gutenberg was democratizing in terms of access. It made it possible for anyone to access the information, but it still kept authorship to a very select few. And I think that the web and just the general digital revolution that's happening now is a revolution not just in access, but also in authorship. I mean, anyone can write. In fact, people are writing all the time, as we talked about today. So, I mean, I think that's generally a good thing for democracy. I do think that the question that we were discussing just before that, the question of how the technology changes the quality of writing is something I think a lot about. But I also think about it, in terms of the word processor versus the pen and paper. I find myself really taking for granted that when I write a paragraph, I write it on my screen, and then I can tweak it, and I can move things around, I can change a sentence. And, having grown up with that type of technology, I'm often amazed at the type of sentences that a Henry James would write longhand. There was, of course, editing and things that happened there, but...
You've never done it any other way, right?
I mean, I write longhand occasionally, but it's always been I mean, it's always been typing for me outside of notes in classes 10, 15 years ago.
But you never, when you wrote papers in college, you never printed them out and marked them up, or you never went through a kind of process that went analog from digital.
No.
Yeah.
I actually think that's an interesting point, because so on the one hand, look, believe me, oh my gosh, I'm incredibly great. In the same way that I'm massively grateful to Google, I don't understand how people wrote books before Google. I definitely do not understand how people wrote books before word processing, right? I mean, what a nightmare. So I'm incredibly grateful to it. On the other hand, first of all, there's this funny point of diminishing returns that's happening for me, which is that as we all get more and more internet addicted, the efforts I have to go to get myself off of that demon and just sit down and write are more and more extreme. I mean, I'm one of these people who's downloaded Freedom, that program that will lock you off the internet for whatever amount of time you specify. And interestingly, now I find myself going back to longhand. I haven't written in longhand since, 7th grade or whatever, basically. But I find myself going back to it precisely to get away from, because now, of course, the machine that I'm supposed to do my work on is also connected to like all of the most interesting and distracting information in the known universe, and that's a problem. So I work to get away from it. But I also find that the question about going back to analog at some step of the process, if we start losing that, I actually do wonder what will, and I wonder in the sincere sense, I don't have a prediction about this, but I wonder what will happen to the quality of what we write. Because for me, at least, I know for sure that when I print something and read it out, whether it's mine or someone else's, I notice things I don't notice on the screen. And the editing that happens in that analog stage is crucial, and the thing gets much better. So I wonder if that piece drops out.
And is that because you learn to write that way and are still habituated to that, or do you think there's something intrinsic about it? Because Chris clearly doesn't need that stage.
It's a good question, but because, I mean, I barely learn that way. I mean, I've been writing and editing on a screen for as long, not quite as long as I can remember, but certainly for as long as I've been, anything even approximating a professional writer or even like a high school writer, But there is, I don't know if it's about, I mean, we need like a neuroscientist. I have no idea why it is that looking at something on the printed page, it could be that it's any two contrast cases. It could be that looking at it on your Mac versus looking at it on your iPhone shows you different things. It's not necessarily about the switch back to analog, but there is something about seeing it in a different form, reading it in a different way that I find actually is a crucial stage of the refining process. I read my entire book out loud about 3 times on like physical paper to edit it.
Yeah. What skills do older, pre-digital people need to take advantage of the digital age? I can't imagine anyone in this room asked that question, but they're clearly asking on behalf of a parent or grandparent. But yeah.
It's worth it. I mean, it's worth keeping up. It's worth finding out what Twitter is. It really is. I mean, it's one of those things you feel like I can live without, and you can. But if you make even an hour or two's effort and get some people who know about it to help you out, and you start following smart people on Twitter, it's like the best bulletin board for good things to read in the world. It's not something to sneer at 'cause it's short. It's short because it's telling you, it's like a telegram telling you where to go to find the pot of gold. And it is addictive, but I think it's a great gift to literacy. If you follow the right people, it's constantly smart people telling you about smart things to read. And it's like reading in general. I mean, you graduate from college and your mind just starts getting old and tired, and it takes effort. It's a job to keep up with the arts and with books. It takes real effort, and it's always the best people who do. I mean, people say there's no time, enough time to go to the theater or to read books, and it's always time well spent. And the places we're going now, I think it's worth the effort to find out about some of these things. You may decide to reject them, but I think some of them may open your minds in a really big way.
Anybody want to add anything to that? The only thing I would add to that is that in my experience, this is very much an issue of biological age not being determinative. I think there are some older people, very old people, who somehow become enthusiasts about digital media and are on Twitter and have shifted their reading habits. In many cases, because of it's so much easier to read on a device. My boss was one of the first enthusiasts of the Kindle, and I finally realized when I saw his Kindle, he had it set on 16-point type, and he clearly hadn't really been able to read anything for a long time. But as your eyes get worse, I've got my reading glasses here. It's a lot easier if you can set the font size.
Can I quote you on Twitter? It's kind of a cruel quote. Jacob said something like, Facebook is a smart service for simple people, and Twitter is a simple service for smart people. I think as you put it.
I would take objection.
Yes,
to
exactly. Dwight, I better end this before you get me in any more trouble today. No, but Dwight and I are, we're both enthusiasts about Twitter. Maybe we should talk about it a little bit. I mean, you use it. It sounds like mainly as a discovery engine for what to read in other forms. Is that right?
Yes, and also just smart people making smart comments about the world. That's part of it. But the other part of it is, people telling you, go read this right now.
Yeah. Catherine, I mean, I follow you on Twitter. Are you as kind of Twitter friendly as Dwight is?
I'm very Twitter friendly. I'm way too Twitter friendly. And in fact, speaking to the previous question about what should our attitudes be about these things, the number one thing I would say is like, it's very easy to be change averse just because it's a change. And to be honest, that was, I think initially I kind of had to get dragged onto Twitter and dragged onto Facebook because I felt like, why do I need these things in my life? And I actually find Twitter, no offense, in particular to be, for my career and for what I do, to be incredibly useful. In the way that Dwight's saying, it's essentially it's a highly self-selected magazine of all the things your brilliant friends and the people who you wish were your brilliant friends are reading, and that's a really lovely thing to get to be a part of. I mean, it's sort of a great medium. It's great for everything, right? It's great for, that, for flirting, I mean, you name it, right? Like, that's the problem with it in some senses, is that it's an optimal, quick medium. And the downside, I would say, is that the flow is constant. So you do need to have, on some level, weirdly, it both erodes and requires discipline. I don't know if you find that. It requires a huge amount of self-control to stay off of the thing, because it's like the most interesting magazine in the world that's showing up on your doorstep every 9 nanoseconds, approximately. That's a little bit of a problem. On the other hand, the trade-offs, I think, are worth it. The most interesting things I read now, I read because of Twitter. It's made me into, it's eroded my loyalty to magazines, to be perfectly honest, because now I find...
It's all one big magazine.
It's one big magazine. I don't care. My source memory is shot. I have no idea where I read things anymore. But on the other hand, it distills for me and brings to me things I never would have found before.
We didn't talk about this, but go ahead.
No. What's interesting, though, is that a Pew study came out just this past week about the power of brands in an information-rich economy, and it expressed something that I think I may be a little bit different from you, that I feel very viscerally, which is people feel overwhelmed. And I think you guys mentioned that I don't use Twitter. I don't find it that useful. I find it to be, I find that there's just a lot of stuff there, and in some ways too much stuff. And instead, I look to brands to tell me what are the most important things to read. And sometimes those brands are people, but more often or not, it's an old brand that is adapting smartly to a newer medium. And at least in the wide, if you're not just looking at people who are in the world of books or journalism, but if you're looking at the widest swath of readers, the brand loyalties and brand affinities are actually going up. Because that's what people are using to be a signal that, like, in a world of so much content where a lot of it isn't great, I trust the New York Times or The Economist or whatever brand it is to point me in the direction of something that's important. And at least that's my experience too.
Right.
Yep.
There may be a generational component here too, I would say, and maybe a difference between professional writers and non-writers. I mean, Twitter is more of a broadcasting medium, right? You're speaking to whoever wants to follow you, but you can just follow people, but you can also talk in this way that communicates differently.
Brands matter on Twitter as well.
Yeah.
I read The Republic largely through Twitter. I mean, Tim Noah's columns, whatever I'm reading, I get it through Twitter. But brands matter. I mean, any issue of Slate, I know, or it's not an issue, it's a rolling series of articles, but I know it's going to be pretty damn good because there's smart people there. And probably one episode or one issue of The New Yorker is the best value you can find in the reading world still, I think, for $5.99. So I think brands still matter.
Yeah. We have an online question, which is picking up on what we've been talking about. Who would you recommend following on Twitter?
Chris.
I've already confessed that I don't use Twitter that much. So,
but I will say you can follow people on Facebook too, right? Which takes off from the Twitter technology. But I was surprised to discover I have thousands of followers on Facebook who are not the same as your friends on Facebook, but people who elect to read you, but you don't elect to let them into everything. Yeah. Do you use that? I mean, broadening a little bit and including Facebook, this sort of technology of getting suggestions from people you may not know personally?
I tend to, the thing that's interesting about Facebook that's a little bit different than Twitter is Facebook tends to reward the links or the pieces that are trending amongst, at a given moment amongst your friends and the people that you're connected to. And to some extent to the brands and the thought leaders that you follow. So it's more likely that you're pointed in the direction of something because several people are chatting about it at a given moment in time, rather than, you just sort of dip into a stream of lots of little quotes and you choose, oh, this person liked this, so I'll go and maybe try that out. So it's a little bit of a different experience in that regard.
That gave you guys time to think about who to recommend.
Well, the way to follow people on Twitter is to find someone you love and you think has great opinions and ideas and see who they're following and go after some of those people. That's how you do it, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know, what do you think?
No, I would second that, and I would also say the way to follow people on Twitter is minimally. I mean, what you don't want is, because the medium is so overwhelming, I would say you're best off being extraordinarily selective, following a small number of people who reliably link to really, really interesting things. And what counts as really interesting is going to depend on what you care about in the world. So, I follow I would say 80% of the people I follow are just straight up book nerds. They're like the Dwights of the world, right? And that's great because I want to read what people are writing about books, and then I'm interested in, you know, politics and in certain niches thereof, and so I follow very selectively, so that's the kind of information I'm getting. And very quickly you learn there are people who are just geniuses of the medium, and they're fun and smart and witty, and they're constantly providing good stuff, and then there's people who aren't, and you stop following them. As Dwight said, it's like the real world.
Does anyone have a last word on any of this?
I'm very bullish on where we're going in terms of reading and writing in this country. I feel like, you know, good sentences are all that matter, and so many people still care about them. We're just talking about new ways to get them, I feel like. I don't, you know, I feel like we're just getting more of them, but I don't know.
I feel that ending on the phrase "good sentences are all that matter." I can work with that.
I'll second that.
Well, we have several writers of some of the best sentences going right now, and I should say speakers of some of the best sentences. We did not settle anything today. I didn't think we would, but I'm amazed how much we covered. And please join me in thanking this terrific panel. Thank you.
You come to the reception.